J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. Read to you by New Streaks. Chapter 1. The Boy Who Lived. Mr. and Mrs. Dursley of Number 4 Privet Drive were proud to say that they were perfectly normal. Thank you very much. They were the last people you'd expect to be involved in anything strange or mysterious because they just didn't hold with such nonsense. Mr. Dursley was the director of a firm called Grunnings, which made drills. He was a big, beefy man with hardly any neck, although he did have a very large moustache. Mrs. Dursley was thin and blonde and had nearly twice the usual amount of neck, which came in very useful as she spent so much of her time craning over garden fences, spying on the neighbours. The Dursleys had a small son called Dudley, and in their opinion, there was no finer boy anywhere. The Dursleys had everything they wanted, but they also had a secret, and their greatest fear was that somebody would discover it. They didn't think they could bear it if anyone found out about the Potters. Mrs. Potter was Mrs. Dursley's sister, but they hadn't met for several years. In fact, Mrs. Dursley pretended that she didn't even have a sister, because her sister and her good-for-nothing husband were as un-Dursley-ish as it was possible to be. The Dursleys shuddered to think what the neighbours would say if the Potters arrived in the street. The Dursleys knew that the Potters had a small son too, but they had never even seen him. The boy had another good reason. This boy was another good reason for keeping the Potters away. They didn't want Dudley mixing up with a child like that. When Mr. and Mrs. Dursley woke up on the grey, dull Tuesday, our story starts. There was nothing about the cloudy skies outside to suggest that strange and mysterious things would soon be happening all over the country. Mr. Dursley hummed as he picked out his most boring tie for work, and Mrs. Dursley gossiped away happily as she wrestled a screaming Dudley into his high chair. None of them noticed a large, tawny owl fluttered past the window. At 8:30, Mr. Dursley picked up his briefcase, pecked Mrs. Dursley on her cheek, and tried to kiss Dudley goodbye, but missed, because Dudley was now having a tantrum and throwing his cereals at the walls. "Little tyke," chortled Mr. Dursley as he left the house. He got into his car and backed out of the number 4's drive. It was on the corner of the street that he noticed the first sign of something peculiar. A cat reading a map. For a second, Mr. Dursley didn't realize what he had seen. Then he jerked his head around again. There was a tabby cat standing on the corner of Privet Drive, but there wasn't a map in sight. What could he be thinking of? It must have been a trick of the light. Mr. Dursley blinked and stared at the cat. It stared back. As Mr. Dursley drove around the corner and up the road, he watched the cat in his mirror. It was now reading the sign that said, Privet Drive. No, looking at the sign. Cats couldn't read maps or signs. Mr. Dursley gave himself a little shake and put the cat out of his mind. As he drove toward town, he thought of nothing except a large order of drills he was hoping to get that day. But on the edge of town, drills were driven out of his mind by something else. As he sat in his usual morning traffic jam, he couldn't help but noticing that there seemed to be a lot of strangely dressed people about. People in cloaks. Mr. Dursley couldn't bear people who dressed in funny clothes. The get-ups you saw in young people. He supposed that it was some stupid new fashion. He drummed his fingers on the steering wheel, and his eyes fell on a huddle of those weirdos standing close by. They were whispering excitedly together. Mr. Dursley was enraged to see that a couple of them weren't young at all. Why, that man had to be older than he was, and was wearing an emerald green cloak. The nerve of him! But then it struck Mr. Dursley that this was probably some silly stunt. Those people were obviously collecting for something. Yes, that would be it. The traffic moved on, and a few minutes later, Mr. Dursley arrived at Grunning's parking lot, his mind back on drills. Mr. Dursley always sat with his back to the window in his office on the 9th floor. If he hadn't, he might have found it harder to concentrate on drills that morning. He didn't see the owl swooping past in broad daylight, though people down in the street did. They pointed and gazed open-mouthed as owl after owl sped overhead. Most of them had never seen an owl, even at night time. Mr. Dursley, however, had a perfectly normal, owl-free morning. He yelled at 5 different people. He made several important telephone calls and shouted a bit more. He was in a very good mood until lunchtime, when he thought he'd stretch his legs and walk across the road to buy himself a bun from the bakery. He had forgotten all about the people in cloaks until he passed a group of them next to the baker's. He eyed them angrily as he passed. He didn't know why, but they made him uneasy. This bunch were whispering excitedly too, and he couldn't see a single collecting tin. He was on his way back past them, clutching a large donut in a bag, that he caught a few words of what they were saying. The Potters! That's right, that's what I heard. Yes, their son, Harry. Mr. Dursley stopped dead. Fear flooded him. He looked back at the whisperers as if he wanted to say something to them, but thought better of it. He dashed back across the road, hurried up to his office, snapped at his secretary. Snapped at his secretary not to disturb him, seized his telephone, and had almost finished dialing his home number when he changed his mind. He put the receiver back down and stroked his mustache, thinking, no, he was being stupid. Potter wasn't such an unusual name. He was sure there were lots of people called Potters who had a son called Harry. Come to think of it, he wasn't even sure his nephew was called Harry. He'd never seen the boy. Might have been Harvey or Harold. There was no point in worrying Mrs. Dursley. She always got so upset at any mention of her sister. He didn't blame her if he'd had a sister like that. But all the same, those people in cloaks. He found it a lot harder to concentrate on drills that afternoon, and when he left the building at 5 o'clock, he was still so worried that he walked straight into someone just outside the door. Sorry, he grunted as the tiny old man stumbled and almost fell. It was a few seconds before Mr. Dursley realised that the man was wearing a violet cloak. He didn't seem at all upset at being almost knocked to the ground. On the contrary, his face split into a wide smile, and he spoke in a squeaky voice that made passersby stare.
Don't be sorry, my dear sir, for nothing could upset me today. Rejoice, for you know who was gone at last. Even muggles like yourself should be celebrating this happy day.
And the old man hugged Mr. Dursley around the middle and walked off. Mr. Dursley stood rooted to the spot. He had been hugged by a complete stranger. He also thought he had been called a muggle, whatever that was. He was rattled. He hurried to his car, set off for home, hoping he was imagining things which he had never hoped before, because he didn't approve of imagination. As he pulled into the driveway of number 4, the first thing he saw, and it didn't improve his mood, was the tabby cat he'd spotted that morning. It was now sitting on the garden wall. He was sure it was the same one, the same markings around his eyes. Shoo! Mr. Dursley said loudly. The cat didn't move, just gave him a stern look. Is this normal cat behaviour? Mr. Dursley wondered. Trying to pull himself together, he let himself into the house. He was still determined not to mention anything to his wife. Mrs. Dursley had had a nice, normal day. She told him over dinner about how Mrs. Next Door's problems with her daughter and how Dudley had learned a cool new word. Won't. Mr. Dursley tried to act normally. When Dudley had been put to bed, he went into the living room in time to catch the last report of the evening news. And finally, bird watchers everywhere have reported that the nation's owls have been behaving very unusually today. Although owls normally hunt at night and are hardly ever seen in daylight, there have been hundreds of sightings of these birds flying in every direction since sunrise. Experts are unable to explain why the owls have suddenly changed their sleeping patterns. The newscaster allowed himself again. A grin. Most mysterious. And now over to you, Jim McGuffin, with the weather. Going to be any more showers of owls tonight, Jim?
Well, Ted, said the weatherman, I don't know about that, but I know it's not only owls that have been acting very oddly today. Viewers as far apart as Kent, Yorkshire, and Dundee have been phoning in to tell me that instead of the rain I promised yesterday, they've had a downpour of shooting stars. Perhaps people have been celebrating bonfire night early. It's not until next week, folks, but I can promise a wet night tonight.
Mr. Dursley sat frozen in his armchair. Shooting stars all over Britain. Owls flying by daylight. Mysterious people in cloaks all over the place. And a whisper. A whisper about the Potters. Mrs. Dudley came into the living room carrying 2 cups of tea. It was no good. You'd have to say something to her. He cleared his throat nervously. Petunia, dear. You haven't heard anything from your sister lately, have you? As he had expected, Mrs. Dursley looked shocked and angry. After all, they normally pretended she didn't have a sister.
No.
She said sharply.
Why?
The funny stuff on the news, Mr. Dursley mumbled. Owls, shooting stars, and there was a lot of funny-looking people in town today.
So?
Snapped Mrs. Dursley. Well, I just thought that maybe it was something to do with, her crowd. Mrs. Dursley sipped her tea through pursed lips. Mr. Dursley wondered whether he'd tell her he'd heard the name Potter. He decided he didn't dare. Instead, he said, as casually as he could, "There's Sutton. He's about Dudley's age now, right? Wouldn't he?"
I suppose so,
said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What was his name again? Howard, isn't it?
Harry. Nasty coming name, if you ask me.
Oh, yes. Mrs. I'm confused. Crap, I just lost my spot. I'm sorry.
I suppose so,
said Mrs. Dursley stiffly. What's his name again? Howard, isn't it?
Harry. Nasty common name, if you ask me.
Oh, yes, said Mr. Dursley, his heart sinking horribly. Yes, I quite agree. He didn't say another word on the subject as they went upstairs to bed. While Mrs. Dursley was in the bathroom, Mr. Dursley crept into the bedroom window and peered down into the front garden. The cat was still there, was staring down Privet Drive as if it were waiting for something. Was he imagining things? Could all this have anything to do with the Potters? If it did, if it got out that they were related to a pair of... Well, he couldn't bear it. The Dursleys got to bed. Mrs. Dursley fell asleep quickly, but Mr. Dursley lay awake, turning it all over in his mind. His last comforting thought before he fell asleep was that even if the Potters were involved, there was no reason for them to come near him and Mrs. Dursley. The Potters knew very well what he and Petunia thought about them and their kind. He couldn't see how he and Petunia got mixed up in anything that might be going on. He yawned and turned over. It couldn't affect them. How very wrong he was.